We're quite fascinated.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the program People, Politics and Power. I am Imoni Amarere. Almost 8 decades after the establishment of the United Nations and the end of the Second World War, two events that altered the international system and defined the right of territories to self-determination. There are still territories that are under one form of colonial domination or the other. The United Nations Charter defines such non-self-governing territories as spaces whose people have not yet attained a full measure of self-government. It has set 2030 as the terminal date for the 17 or there such places to attain independence. While 15 of the territories are under the administration of 3 veto-wielding permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, that is, talking about Britain, United States, and France. The remaining 2 are under the control of New Zealand and Morocco. Although the UN has always shown interest in supporting decolonization processes globally, through its Special Committee on Decolonization and as part of its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security, several millions of people still exist under colonial domination. Now that is the case with territories like Western Sahara, which is controlled by Morocco, and Puerto Rico, which is governed by the United States. The question therefore is, why has the UN failed to complete their total decolonization? And what is holding back the full independence of these territories 64 years after the United Nations General Assembly's Resolution 1514 of 14 December 1960 on the necessity to speedily and unconditionally end colonialism? And these were some of the critical issues that the Society for International Relations Awareness dissected at a 2-day conference here in the Nigerian capital Abuja earlier this week, when it brought together experts, diplomats, liberation struggle activists, representatives of some non-self-governing territories, civil society, and advocacy groups from across the world. On the program today, we shall beam our searchlight on the unfinished decolonization process and interrogate the possible constraints faced by the United Nations in this regard. I'm joined in the studio by 3 of the participants in that conference that we talked about earlier on. And right from my immediate left is Candace Alana Natalie Sebro. She is the leader of the Caribbean delegation to that conference. Thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you for having me.
We also have with us in the studio Mrs. Esteli Capote Maldonado. She is the leader of the Latin American delegation to the conference. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. I also represent Puerto Rico, a country liberation movement.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you.
Right. And of course, the convener of that conference himself, Ogwe Lakemfa, a President, Society for International Relations Awareness, CIRA, is here with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yes.
All right, we'll launch into our discussion right after this timeout. Stay with us.
Of our dream, the Nigeria we need is the united, indissoluble, and cohesive Nigeria, which guarantees equity, fairness, justice, and prosperity for its citizens. That is our focus on people, politics, and power. It is fresh, insightful, impactful. It's a must-watch. People, politics, and power on AIT.
Thank you so much for staying with us. People, politics, and power today is looking at the decolonization process around the world. Now, almost 80 years after the birth of the United Nations, there are territories around the world that are still under colonial domination. So, wait, let me begin with you. Why are we talking about decolonization at this point in time? I mean, 80 years after the establishment of the UN?
Thank you very much. I think it's a failure of all of us, both those who are free and those who are under colonialism. Because when you colonize a country, you own that country. You think you own it, and the peoples also. It's like slavery. When you own a human being, it's called slavery. So when you own a country, it's colonialism, more or less. And what we've had is that some of the most powerful countries in the world, you mentioned New Zealand, there is also Indonesia, for instance, owning parts of Papua West Guinea. They are so powerful that sometimes they even force the UN to drop some of those colonies from their list. For instance, today, you have 17 colonies officially recognized by the UN, but there are more than that. There are at least 61 colonies around the world. So you take a country like Puerto Rico, 3.5 million people. They are not mentioned by the UN. You know, you take a country as important as Martinique. They are not mentioned by the UN. So there are many territories that are not mentioned by the UN. So these powerful countries have also ensured that they are not discussed, or if they are discussed, that they use their veto power. But the UN has continued to have, its committee on decolonization. It is called the C24, to decolonize all territories in the world that are still colonies. So the problem, therefore, is the rest of us, where we are not insisting. For instance, in Africa, you have Western Sahara. Western Sahara is occupied, most of it, by Morocco. And all Morocco has done has been to use its economic power to buy influence. And because it's backed by Spain, the former colonial master, it's backed by the US, and it's backed by France. So you find a lot of countries don't want to come against these countries. So they simply keep quiet. But Western Sahara is a member of the OAU, is a founding member of the African Union. And there are all sorts of laws and rulings in its favor, including by the African courts. And the European courts have had at least 3 rulings on Western Sahara to say no European company should go and exploit the resources of Western Sahara without the consent of the people and the Polisario movement that governs it. So it's been a failure on our part. And what we are trying to do at the level of the Society for International Relations Awareness is to ensure that first we don't forget that these colonies are there. Secondly, to prick our consciences. Thirdly, to say, look, if we can end apartheid in South Africa and there are negotiations, there's no reason why we cannot have negotiations at the level of these territories. So one of the things we did was to invite the liberation movements to attend. We also invited the countries administering them. When you use the UN lingo, the UN says there are countries administering, these territories. And we invited them, to this conference. Unfortunately, none of them came. In terms of, I'm talking about those occupying those territories. None of them came. It's the liberation people that came. And it seems that these countries do not think it is time for dialogue and negotiations. But we hope that they will understand that no matter how long it takes, you cannot continue to colonize the people. I mean, like Puerto Rico that Esteli comes from, it's been colonized for 125 years by the US. It wasn't originally an American colony. It was a colony of Spain, but then there was a war between Spain and US, and the US captured Puerto Rico, and since then they've been there. But even the United Nations continue to say, look, the US should vacate Puerto Rico and allow its citizens the freedom to decide what they want to do. And let me also say that in negotiating with about colonies, it is possible that you might have countries or colonies that say, okay, we want to join the mainland. That would be free to, they'll be free to do that. But if they also say, no, we want independence, they should be allowed.
Which, of course, brings me to the issue of Puerto Rico, Mrs. Estelle. Has there at any point been a situation where Puerto Ricans decided that, look, they want their independence, they want the occupation of the U.S. to end?
Yes, many times, even before the USA invasion in 1898, Puerto Rico's struggle for independence began officially in 1811, and then when Venezuela was liberated. And the same happened in 1868 through the Grito de Lares, which was in junction with the Cuban War, and they had the Grito de Yara. And then during the period of U.S. invasion, we had at least three powerful manifestations. And the first one was before, when we were included in the list of territories, as Owe mentioned, Owe La Kimfa mentioned, Puerto Rico was there and was invited to the UN as a liberation movement. The second event was provision to the U.S. Trying to take Puerto Rico out of the list. The Nationalist Party organized a revolution, armed revolution in Puerto Rico during 1950s. Although knowing that they were going to shut down, but at least they wanted to get international attention on the issue that the United States was taking Puerto Rico out of the list. In fact, the U.S. Was able to take Puerto Rico out of the list to the 748 resolution in 1952, sorry. And then Puerto Rico, again, through the Nationalist Party, attacked the Congress, the U.S. Congress again. 4 nationalists were sentenced to prison during that period, and it also took international attention. Then after that, it will pass, Puerto Rico was totally invisible from the UN. Because of the 748 resolution. And it took Puerto Rico, thanks to the Pan-African and Nigeria groups in particular, that they promoted with the Soviets, they promoted the resolution 1514-15. And Puerto Rico, and that allowed that recognition of the self-determination and independence of the countries, even though those that are not recognized in the list, forced the C24 to include Puerto Rico in the list. Not in the list, but in the topics that they have to discuss every year. But it wasn't until the 72 that Puerto Rico, because in that time the pro-independence movement led by Juan Maribras, they've been keep fighting about independence, and they were finally included as part of the annual agenda in 1962. And from that, we have already 47 resolutions. We go every year, but 47 resolutions has taken to a point where nothing has changed. In fact, in favor of the independence movement in Puerto Rico, independence right. But on the contrary, just in 2007, the U.S. imposed the oversight fiscal board to administer the finances of Puerto Rico, to manage the finances of Puerto Rico against the elections. These people are not voted for. They are nominated and seconded by the Congress and the President of the U.S. So we are in a more critical position now than when we were before, where the Nationalist Party was as an observer in the UN.
The question to ask is, what nature is this colonialism, this domination by the U.S. taking in Puerto Rico? Is it just the denial of political rights or of economic rights? Are there other rights that are breached? by the continued domination of Puerto Rico or the continued governance of Puerto Rico by the U.S.?
Well, take for example the considerations in terms of economic exchange. We have to do everything. U.S. controls everything. The coast of Puerto Rico, how goods are interexchanged. We have to use the U.S. Navy, the vessels of the U.S. It's by imposition that we have to use the naval merchant buildings of the U.S. And for example, if I wanted to take the so much beautiful textiles that you produce here in Nigeria, I'll have to do it through the U.S. And ultimately, it will require the approval of the U.S. for Puerto Ricans to have imports from other countries. That's for one. But in a daily basis right now, the U.S. is violating the rights, the human rights of Puerto Rican when they are imposing this management board, which only purpose is to guarantee the payment of an illegal debt. And the human rights violation comes when that board requires the payment prior and in what matters affects the Puerto Rican people's social and economic development. And that is against not only the 1514 resolution, but against the UN foundational card. Another mentions is the privatization, and this go more to more forms, new forms of neocolonial intervention in countries. But for example, the privatization of public services, as power, as water, as medicines, as doctors, the privatization of education, closing of schools, the forced and continuous immigration since 1930s. Puerto Rico has today more people in the U.S. and around the world than in the island. In Puerto Rico, we have 3.5, but in the U.S. only we have 6 million. And that's the forced immigration that the U.S. is forcing, because what they want is to keep the land, not the people of Puerto Rico. What they want is for a referendum that the same as the New Caledonian. They want the French want the New Caledonians to get out of the countries. When they do a referendum, the annexation or any other not recognized form wins. But the Puerto Ricans are staying, even though a big mass is leaving. So that is another part of it.
So there is a forced migration of Puerto Ricans into the U.S., and the U.S.
Yes,
in
the
exchange,
gentrification,
yes.
U.S. people coming into Puerto Rico, taking our land, taking our power force, taking our resources, taking our coast, misusing our water, our precious water. We're an island. They are considering now going back to mining, which was really a really high struggle during the 80s. And well, we have many examples. We have the military bases still. They conquer the natural reserves, and Puerto Ricans are not allowed to enter to some of these natural reserves because they are so reserved, even for Puerto Ricans. But we have many examples. We can go around this.
All right, Candace, let me turn to you. And first to ask, how many territories in the Caribbean, where you come from, are still under colonial domination?
Well, when we do the analysis of colonialism and we think about decolonization within the Caribbean, as Estelle said, we deal not only with those that are actually colonized, but we also deal with those that are under that system of neocolonialism. So I would even venture to say that the vast majority of the Caribbean countries still feel affected by that reality of neocolonialism. So when we talk about that concept of resources being extracted, decisions being made for those within the country, and all of the consequences and the effects of that. There's a large majority of Caribbean islands that still feel that way. Specifically, one of the struggles that we are carrying forward, because I represent the Assembly of Caribbean People, as well as Alba Movimientos, which is a coalition, for want of a better word, of movements throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. And so when we do our analysis, in this current moment, we are lobbying for self-determination within Haiti, because the complication and the reality within Haiti at this current point is not only something that would have happened between all of the confusions within amongst Haitians, but there's also been U.S. intervention, there's been UN intervention within Haiti that's constantly been happening over years. And even with the presidential council that they have at this point, they recently would have named a prime minister who's Haitian. However, it's also a Haitian who has been working with the UN for a number of years. So there's been analysis around that. And that self-determination of what is happening amongst the people and the coordination and the relation with the people has not been happening. That very same process where they enter into the country, they use land that could be used for food, for the development, for housing, etc. They take that specific land and they use it for large multinationals. They come into that land and they exploit it for military bases, etc. And then the people are the ones suffering and they create a dependency for something as basic as food. So now in order to eat, they look outside. So there's a food dependency throughout the Caribbean, which is a major struggle that we're carrying forward as well. And even in Puerto Rico, they can tell you about the reality where they depend on all the food that has to come from the outside. So when COVID happened, there was also like, oh my gosh, we're going to have issues to eat. That was also a consideration that was happening. So we lobby for absolute self-determination for the people and by the people. So that's one of the main struggles that we actively do today. Now, when we talk about those that are actually under the, well, they're not on the list. They've been excluded. But the main ones that we're championing, obviously because of those who are involved in the Assembly of Caribbean People, would be Puerto Rico, of course, and also Martinique. And so the analysis that has been happening, as Sally would have alluded to them being considered like second-class citizens, there are some major impacts that they would have undergone. There was a national poisoning, more or less, in Martinique because they would have used a toxin called chlordecone. They would have allowed it in Martinique, whereas it was not allowed in France. And about 90% of the population was affected and is still affected to this date. That's why we are currently lobbying for the reparations for that incident that would have happened within the vast majority of the Martinican population. And another thing that Sally didn't mention, I think, was the VA case incident, where they would have done testing and people still have health issues because of that to date, because of them using that specific plot of land and whatever it is they use inside of there would have affected all the people to date for the benefit of the countries on the outside. So that in itself is something that those are major struggles that we continue to carry forward. And that's why I'm here, accompanying the amazing Estelle in this event on decolonization, because when they enter into the countries and they extract, we refer to it as a hemorrhaging of resources. They do not consider the persons living there, and they do not even include them in the governance of their own country.
It's a familiar pattern of colonialism, especially so in Africa. And one of such familiar parts is the divide and rule tactics that the colonial masters use. Do you have a feel of that in the Caribbean today, that the colonialists are able to divide the people against themselves in order to better exploit them, in order to better dominate their societies and extract whatever they want to extract? Is that happening?
Absolutely.
Are they dealing with the elites of the various societies in an attempt to impoverish the entire society?
Well, absolutely. Divide and rule has been a tactic. I can speak specifically to Trinidad and Tobago on that because they would have first brought in African slaves, and then they would have brought in indentured laborers who would have been of East Indian descent. And so to date, there was a characterization of these poor, horrible slaves and then the Indians that were supposedly better. And of course, there's a psychological impact where they are always looking to their white or Caucasian master. And so that issue of race has been used constantly and is still used to date. When we talk about governance, we have predominantly two major parties. People refer to them as the African Party and the East Indian Party. And culturally, when elections come around, the level of hatred that you see that happens is astounding in a country where the Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa would have said, "Oh, what a beautiful rainbow of people." However, when elections come around, it's really surprising, and it's impressive how these people who would maybe be at a bar having drinks together all of a sudden demonstrate such hate towards one another. So that tactic, of course, we know has been used throughout the Caribbean. And even in terms of the race question that I mentioned, one of the things that we always say is that Haiti, to date, was treated and is treated as, well, maybe I don't want to say second-class citizens because it's worse than that. And this was done because when Haiti won their independence in 1804, it wasn't just about them being excluded from the geopolitical reality at that time, which was predominantly white supremacists, but also they were forced by France to pay a debt for their own liberation, right? So we refer to it like the independence debt. And that racial analysis, that narrative of race is something that is used to date, and is something that a lot of people, even Caribbean people, would be impacted by psychologically. So that is definitely a reality.
And you can add to that the barrier of language, which is also a strategy of the imperialism to divide and conquer. While we have a common area that we all love, which is the Caribbean Sea, but we don't dominate it as countries because, and the language barrier is some of us talk Spanish, some of us talk French, some of us talk English, and it's difficult also to manage, to communicate among each other with these conditions. That's also part of the division.
Can I just, sorry.
Yes.
Can I just add to that? A flight between islands should, in theory, two neighboring islands being next to each other should be inexpensive or reasonable, I would think, right? One would think. But the reality is many times in order to leave our islands, we have to go through the United Kingdom or through the United States. So sometimes it's cheaper to go from Trinidad and Tobago, which is near to South America, it's cheaper to go to Miami than to go right next door in the Caribbean, which is insane.
Now that's a very familiar story away. I mean, the use of tribe, language, and religion to divide people. I mean, it's a very familiar story right here in Africa, right here in Nigeria. And that plays into the narrative of the imperialists. But the question is, what objective did this conference that you organized, that you hosted, what was the objective of that conference? And what did it achieve, if at all?
Well, first to talk about connecting peoples and places, you'll find that a place like the Canary Islands is in West Africa. And if you fly from Lagos, you can get there maybe in 1.5 hours. But to travel there, because now it's put as part of Europe, you move from Canary Islands to Spain. Then from Spain, you travel to Turkey, and then from Turkey to Lagos. You see the complication. The objective of that conference was actually, one, to highlight the fact that there are people still under colonialism. Two, to see whether we can bring together the colonized and the colonialists to discuss. Three, what roles can we play? The UN is playing a role, but we are not satisfied with it. Because what the UN does every time is, at the end of a decade, they declare another decade of decolonization. They've declared 4 so far now, which will end in the next 6 years. And so we've asked the UN exactly what are you doing? The UN will hold conferences on these colonies and be talking about climate change, COVID-19, SDGs, but not really about the process of decolonization. So what we try to do was to discuss, to say, look, what do we do to have an action plan? For instance, if you go to history, you find that there are some colonies, like the Philippines, like India, when they were colonies, were also members of the League of Nations and the UN. So we're saying that why can't, some of these places like Martinique you mentioned, like Western Sahara. I mean, it's embarrassing that Western Sahara is not a member of the UN. It's not admitted to the UN. So why can't they, with Puerto Rico and countries like that, be members of the UN under whatever special arrangements that can be done? So those are things we try to do to draw out people, draw out the UN itself, and to tell the UN that, look, you can do better than this, than sit down, making declarations. For instance, you can take that of Western Sahara. You can say, look, Western Sahara, it's supposed to have independence in 1975. So, and a lot of them, live in the the refugee camps in Tindouf, Algeria. In the next 4 or 5 years, can we take these following steps to ensure that Morocco lives? Because Morocco did not originally colonize Western Sahara. It was a colony of Spain, but when Spain was leaving, it handed that territory to Mauritania and Morocco. So it's possible for the UN to insist that, look, Western Sahara will be decolonized in the next 3 or 4 years, and to admit them into the UN. The same thing with Puerto Rico. Yeah,
so the question is, who is listening? To all of these efforts,
Yeah.
considering the fact that the colonizing powers in these various places are the ones who run the United Nations.
Yeah. It also happened in the case of South Africa. It happened in the case of Namibia and in the case of Zimbabwe. Even in the case of Mozambique and Angola, they were the powerful countries in the world were those running those territories. But and don't forget that the US and the UK, for instance, declared that anybody who fought against the apartheid system was a terrorist. So people like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu were officially terrorists. In fact, until 4 or 5 years after Mandela was president of South Africa, officially in the US, he was a terrorist. You get it? But we never stopped fighting. And what we need to do now is to bring people together, to let the world know that there is colonialism. These countries are colonized. Bring it up in this. And now that we have social media to try to coordinate something like that, and let people know, let our children also know that it's not natural for one country to occupy the other country. And also to then link them. For instance, there's the Amba movement in the Caribbean. We can link them with the comrades, in North America, in the US. Look, something very interesting happened at this conference we had. We had African Americans who came, and they came in support of the colonies. They are not originally, they are around one of them joked at the conference to say, do you know that the colonized countries are even better than us, African Americans? And they said the reason for that is that they have lands we don't have. They have particular territories that they want, decolonized. We are scattered all over the US. We don't have anything, So a number of them came, and some of those groups actually are major advocates of the colonial countries to say, look, these countries must be decolonized. So
And I think it's important to recognize, that always very humble about the great stuff he does. But what the CIRA is doing, it's very important, but because it's taking the issue of the eradication of the colonies out of the walls of the UN. Right now, a conversation occurs every year during the summer, and only the ones in the UN and even some of the countries that are part of the Decolonisation Committee get information, get some reports on that. But what the CIRA is doing, it's courageous and important because it's a true action and effort to get the topic of decolonization out of the UN walls and to be spread through the world and to begin. I see it as and I thank the CIRA for this because I see it as the new seed for the true emancipation and eradication of decolonization of the remaining colonies in the world.
He just made reference to the anti-apartheid movement for the liberation of South Africa. That movement was championed essentially by national governments. How much of that is happening with these colonized territories right now, like Puerto Rico? How much of effort is being put in by other liberated national governments around the world in fighting in the struggle to decolonize the 61 territories or so colonies that are still remaining?
Well, that's a great question because one of the things that keeps trembling the U.S. Within the Caribbean, it's precisely the democratic parties that has taken over some of the countries in Latin America. Let's mention Venezuela. And obviously the champion, the solidarity champion of the Caribbean and the Latin Americas is Cuba. Cuba has been holding the flag of Puerto Rico in the 24 committee for all his history. All the resolutions that had been approved had involved directly a work of the Cubans. And we can mention also the NOAL, which are the no-alienated countries. We can mention the CELAC, the Caribbean, Latin American and Caribbean countries, that they form blocs and they act together and they present resolutions in favor of the decolonization and independence of Puerto Rico. And we can mention Mexico, we can mention Colombia now. These progressive governments represent a threat to the United States because they are also taking the word around the world in favor of the decolonization, not only of Puerto Rico, but of the colonies. Because one risk that we have with the United States is how they use the Caribbean to invade our countries, to invade Venezuela, to invade Colombia when progressive governments take action, and when people of Venezuela and Colombian people, countries take action to further more progressive, more social and economic development towards politics and parties. Thanks to now, and I can say that now we have Nigeria through the Syria as well, and that's important for us. That's very important. So we are not alone. But we are gathering more resources. You are right in the sense that we need, and that's an assignment that we take back to Puerto Rico. We need to keep working on our relations with other countries and to make sure that every year that passes, more countries support our efforts by actions, by concrete actions, what the CIRA is doing with Puerto Rico.
In the 1960s, the pressure to decolonize was so much, especially after the resolution 1514. And many countries around the world, particularly in Africa, did attain independence. Now, would you say that it is much more difficult now to struggle for decolonization of any country or any territory compared to what it was in the 1960s. Possibly because of advancement in technology, advancement in politics and the economies of the various dominating countries, and the poverty and underdevelopment of the dominated territories.
Well, I wasn't there in the 60s, but
Over the 70s?
I will give my analysis. I do think that there was a general culture at that time that was calling for liberation, independence, these types of things. The British West Indies actually would have received their independence during that time. But what was the actual shift that was happening at that point? Even in terms of like liberation and identity and pride and culture and these things, they would have happened 1960s, 1970s. So there was a whole movement at that time that was more widespread during that moment. Whereas now, there's been an illusion created that this no longer exists. These issues don't really exist. And we have evidence of it even on the list where you have countries that are currently under colonialism and are not present on the list. So now there's that I'm going to use the word psychological again, there's a belief that there are no longer issues. So there's an invisibilization of the impacts and the realities that exist within the societies. And then the persons who are suffering are made to believe that everything is fine now. They're being sold that narrative. And so that's why it's so important as within the Assembly of Caribbean People and within Alba Movimientos, we are always making sure that we keep our eye on the ball with regards to what is actually happening. We believe in getting in touch with the people to know what the realities are on the ground. And then, of course, we want to echo those voices. So we are happy that they're echoing across to the motherland, to Africa, and we thank OA for that. It is so important because as soon as the voices start to echo globally and across the globe, that's when we throw them over, because you cannot ignore all the people all of the time. And that is very, very important, that we keep, we believe in solidarity across borders, in internationalism, and we continue to build bridges as he would have done through this event. And so that is my position now, that I think that due to that invisibilization, that reality, it is possibly more challenging.
Wait, I'm going to throw that same question to you. Is it a much more difficult task now for the liberation struggle and the liberation groups than it was, say, in the 1960s and early 70s when most dominated territories gained their independence?
Yes, we realized that at the level of Syria, which was why the very symbol we used was that of light, the Greek god of forgetfulness. I mean, the Greeks believed that once you go across that river of that god, you forget everything. Your memory is erased. So it's like the memories of humanity has been erased. You know, they don't ever recognize that there are people who are colonized. And what we've tried to do at the level of Syria is to bring that back, to say, look, don't forget that these people are really there. It's also much more difficult now because there are a lot of countries that became independent, like Nigeria. They've forgotten where they are coming from. You know, so many of them are free as far as they are concerned. There's no problem, you know. And then thirdly, they are faced with economic problems. So, you know, a lot of them do not think this is an issue. When we try to start this whole thing about discussing colonialism, many people in Nigeria say, are there colonies? I will say, yes, of course there are, so and so and so. Okay, but what is our business? You get it? So we want to ensure, I mean, to let people know that it is business of all human beings, that people show, you know, there must be decolonization. And one of the things we've done at this conference is that over 80% of those who came, we had hundreds, over 300 or 400 participants, you know, that came. at least 80% of them are young people. In fact, I was amazed that some parents, I saw 4 or 5 parents that brought their children, under 4 or 5 years old, to that conference for 2 days. And I tried to talk to some of them, say no, for them to know what's going on. So the advantage of that is that the youths that came, they will carry the message forward. We had, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, who was chair, and he was so concerned about the issue of colonialism that he came for 2 full days to chair that conference. And now Professor Gambari is going to be 80 in November. I'm sure he was very happy seeing his grandchildren attending and now being part of a movement, because for him, it's so important. He said, look, when Buhari came into power as a general in 1984, one of the things they achieved was to bring up the issue of colonization. So they then recognized the Palestinian, struggle to say the Palestinian state must be recognized, and they did. And the irony, what happened was that the ambassador of the Palestine stayed so long in Nigeria that he became the dean, the diplomatic corps. The same thing happened. It was the same Gambari as minister that helped to recognize Western Sahara. You get it? And also interestingly, the ambassador of Western Sahara stayed so long in Nigeria that he became the dean of the diplomatic corps. In fact, he was at this conference. He gave, the main address. So things are very, very difficult now. And because of that, colonial powers that have money can virtually do and undo. I'll give you the example of Morocco. Morocco has been able to, at the time it was even paying the salaries of civil servants in some African countries. It's in some African countries money to the extent that 15 of them have gone to open consulates in Western Sahara. They call them consulates, So those are part of the problems that that we have. And the US, with a lot of money it has, is able to silence a lot of countries. But they have to know that it is in the interest of the colonizing powers and UN, and like the US, that people get freedom. Because without, like President Gambari said, without social justice, you can't have peace in the world. It's not possible. So that goes on and on and on. And hopefully, if we're able to, pursue this and ventilate things, more and more people will know that there are problems in the world that we'll have to solve. And there's no way those of us that are independent, that are free, can actually be independent and be free without the dependence and freedom of colonies that are people that are colonizing the world.
So, Estelle, let's look at the projection of 2030 as a cut-off date for decolonization. It's very unlikely that all 61 territories would be decolonized in the next 6 years or even less. But what do you think are the concrete steps that can be taken to ensure that this target date is not a wasted one again?
Yes. Well, one concrete step that can be done by the UN, particularly the General Assembly, and when the countries act in bloc, by regional blocks, admitting Puerto Rico and the other colonies and the rest of the colonies as part of as plenipotentiary members of the UN. That's easy, but they have to do it. It's a very concrete step. The second part would be the
That's hoping that the colonial powers will not oppose it. The way we have seen that done at the UN General Assembly with Palestine.
That's why I'm adding acting in blocks, in regional blocks. It's important that, and I think countries will love to work in blocks for this, because they will bring opportunities for them to block. They will see opportunities to act in regional blocks for other issues that haven't been resolved within their respective regions. But one thing that the General Assembly must do It's to admit Puerto Rico and the colonies, the rest of the colonies as members, as plenipotentiary members of the UN. That's for once. The second is to and the second is to the countries, to each of these administering powers to transfer all the powers without any interference and without exclusion. Transfer all the powers. And
Do you expect that to happen, really?
yes, I do expect it. I do expect it. In fact, today is my birthday, and someone was saying, "Well, I hope you can how do you say have many more birthday ahead." And I said, "Well, only if it means to fight and achieve the Puerto Rican independence, that's okay. If not, I don't care." But yes, we can achieve this. I believe that the world is more united today because although there is a more pressure than ever from the powerful, rich countries, there is also more polarity within the country's development, social economic development. And we know by sure that we can help each other. And we are in a better position today to help each other if we work together. In 1960, I wasn't born yet either, but in the 1960s, more than 10 African countries were included as were admitted in the UN as a bloc because of the Pan-African Asian bloc. And that's an important issue, and then it's an important achievement. Why that can be made again?
So is that a possibility? Do you see that as a possibility moving forward? How can the international community act to assist in the decolonization process?
Well, I definitely do think that in the decolonization process, an important step would be first to recognize the colonies that still exist. So I do think that one of the major steps which we are calling for as the Assembly of Caribbean People is to include in that list and in the process of decolonization every single Caribbean country that is under the yoke of colonialism. And I do think that is an easier step, maybe an easier step, but I do think that is an easy step in that process towards decolonization. But of course, as we have mentioned, and as we would have discussed during the conference as well, that veto process that happens within the UN is also something that they do need to look at, because it does put a hinder in the process of resolutions that they themselves have made and objectives that they themselves have highlighted. So in that construction of the UN, there was a little bit of an oversight, I would say, in terms of actually making concrete advances with regards to major global issues. So that is definitely something that we have highlighted at the conference as well. So I do think that there are concrete steps that they can make immediately, medium term and also long term, that have to be put in place for the complete decolonization of the globe.
As you know, some territories, former colonial territories, had to resort to armed struggle to decolonize. Is that still a possibility in this time and age?
Well, I'm definitely not calling for armed struggle. But I do think that in this day and age, they need to reassess their position on colonialism in this reality today. And I do believe that if you oppress a people, and you constantly oppress a people, they would come to a point where they will resist, and they will do what they believe is necessary to make that happen. So I do think that in terms of the experiences within the world, these powers that be need to reassess how they want to engage with all of the peoples of the globe, because there are things, and there's proof in history, that will naturally happen.
All right, one last word here. You know, as they say, The slave master does not voluntarily give up his slaves.
Yeah.
The slaves have to fight for their own freedom. Moving forward, what do you think, say, in the next 5-10 years would happen?
Yeah, I think, you know, the reason why you have colonialism in the first place is exploitation. So if people can be prevented from exploiting others, or the cost of exploitation, you know, gets, you
Too
know, costlier,
expensive,
too
yeah.
expensive. Yeah, so that's, that's one thing that can be done. And then, you know, talking about the veto power, the conference discussed that also and said, look, don't let us get into all this process about the veto power. Let the veto remain. However, let any resolution by the United Nations General Assembly supersede any veto. In other words, you can discuss things at the level of the Security Council or at committees, but it comes to the plenary of the UNGA, any decision taken by that body will override any other power. You know, so that's one of the things
That would be a tall order.
Yes,
but
yes,
it's achievable.
but a lot of things are tall orders.
Yes.
Like I said, apartheid was a tall order, you know, but we crumbled it.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Owela Kemfa. He is the president of CIRA, that's the Society for International Relations Awareness, which of course organized the conference on decolonization. Decolonizing the World. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And Mrs. Esteli Capote Maldonado is a leader of the Latin American delegation. She is also the leader of the liberation struggle in Puerto Rico. Thank you so much for your time.
Please
Wonderful.
have
Thank
our flag
Great.
as a thanks.
And Candace Alana Natalie Sebro is a leader of the Caribbean delegation at the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Great. And that's our program for today. Please join us again when we bring you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power.